Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Thank you for the thumbs up in the back. All right, I'm going to get things kicked off and welcome you, obviously, to this really important and exciting hearing focusing on the role of the federal government in accelerating our response to climate change. My name is Jonathan Koehn, and I'm honored to serve the Boulder community as the director of the city's Climate Initiatives Department. I obviously need to start by thanking a few people. Of course, our colleagues at the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative for really helping coordinate today's hearing. Of course, I'd like to thank all of today's speakers, especially the petitioners, for really sharing your valuable time. Admittedly, hanging out in city council chambers on such a beautiful fall day is a little painful, so I appreciate everybody showing up. I also want to thank my colleagues in the city's Climate Initiatives Department and our entire community who have continued to lead on actions to preserve the environment, reduce emissions, and tackle climate change, with city council and the community consistently demonstrating support for these efforts. So I wanted to start my remarks by saying it's not coincidental that this hearing is being held less than a week before the 27th Conference of Parties is set to take place in Egypt. As we close out another year marked by record-breaking floods, deadly heat waves, and other extreme weather events on top of a global energy crisis, representatives are going to gather again, this time not with the intention of making any new pledges, but to really focus on whether countries are following through on their commitments made last year. Meanwhile, last week, without a whole lot of fanfare, the UN released its emissions gap report, which looks at what countries are doing to address the climate crisis and what they promise to do in the future. And of course, despite the increasing intensity of climate-driven impacts around the globe, the report finds that many countries are still falling short of their Paris Agreement goals. So the report also finds that urgent sector and system-wide transformations are essential to avoid climate disaster. Such sweeping transformations require large-scale, rapid, and systemic change, making the role of the federal government even more critical. So here in Boulder, we deeply understand the urgency of addressing the climate crisis. Close to home, the impacts are undeniable. The horrific Marshall Fire burned through suburban neighborhoods, displacing thousands of our Boulder County neighbors. And in the recent NCAR and North Shanahan Ridge fires, Boulder experienced frightening close calls. From catastrophic fires and floods to blistering extended heat waves, the past months have provided what we like to say is a chilling reminder of the need to prepare for this new normal of extreme weather events fueled by climate change. And of course, Boulder is in no way unique in this situation. Every community is responding to what people are seeing firsthand, that climate disruption is not looming in some imagined future, it is here and now. And that's a justifiably frightening thing. We also know that climate-driven impacts will impact our community members disproportionately and hit at the heart of our local economies, requiring cities to undertake unprecedented levels of planning and spending. Communities are going to face increased harms, and their costs to adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change are going to continue to climb. And it's really those escalating costs, in fact, that force Boulder, along with our partners Boulder and San Miguel counties, to take legal action against ExxonMobil and Suncor Energy so that taxpayers are not stuck footing the bill alone. So despite the clarity of what needs to happen, there's uncertainty about how we'll get it done. The UN, in unusually blunt language, recently called for political courage and the ability to look beyond current interests. In today's political climate, I would say that's no simple request. And even with the growing engagement of cities, the scale of the crisis is far too great for local or even regional collaborations to solve on their own. Cities simply don't have control or enough resources to direct or manage the enormous changes necessary to strengthen our economies, improve community health, strengthen our resilience, and protect our vulnerable populations. We can recognize the administration efforts to date in elevating the urgency of the climate crisis. The federal government was essential in enacting solutions to past large-scale environmental crises, from the Dust Bowl to toxic pollution that poisoned our waters and air. It's time now, again, for a clear vision that allows federal, state, and local leaders to work together more closely, particularly to help states and cities to access billions of dollars in new federal funding. So, recent federal legislative accomplishments like the bipartisan infrastructure law are stunning, and there's no question the IRA is a step towards greater federal action on both climate change and addressing some of the administration's commitments on environmental justice. But we also need to change the baseline for rulemaking across federal agencies so rules can be designed that are both ambitious and legally durable. So, just to conclude some of my remarks today, I want to emphasize that Boulder is not alone in our efforts. Increasingly, cities and counties are making big changes. We are pressing other levels of government and the private sector to do much more to combat climate change. The IPCC reports reinforce that the coming decade will be one of transitions, for good or ill. The world's scientists are clear on the dangers. They've done their part to inform us on what needs to be done, and it's our job to put that knowledge into action. So I would conclude by saying, on behalf of the Boulder community, I welcome you to today's hearing and want to sincerely thank everyone for your important participation. So I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Dan Galpern, General Counsel and Executive Director for the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your excellent introductory remarks. For the record, again, Dan Galpern, General Counsel and Executive Director of the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative. The CPR Initiative is very grateful to the City of Boulder, and for several reasons. For your leadership in confronting the climate crisis through your own bold initiatives, most importantly, and for your early endorsement of our petition to phase out greenhouse gas pollution to restore a stable and healthy climate, and for your co-sponsorship of this, our first public hearing event on the climate crisis and what more should be done by the United States to confront it. When back on June 16 we filed this petition with the Environmental Protection Agency, we did not anticipate then that we would ourselves need to sponsor such hearings as this one. Indeed, we expected merely to participate in one or more of them. So let me explain. The petition itself argues that human-generated greenhouse gas pollution, in particular carbon dioxide and methane, and the fossil fuels from which they are derived, impose an unreasonable risk of injury to public health and the environment. They are accordingly subject to EPA jurisdiction under the Toxic Substances Control Act, and under it may be phased out pursuant to law. But to get there, the agency would need to open a rulemaking proceeding. And as part of that effort, that rulemaking development, we had advised EPA to hold a number of public hearings, to hear, for instance, from highly impacted communities, those confronting wildfire smoke, or sea level rise, for instance, or those that are downwind from major fossil fuel infrastructure. And in order to better understand the hopes and expectations, for example, of parents concerned about the continuing habitability of the climate system on which their children, of necessity, would need to depend. And also to garner advice as to how best to proceed with the necessary work of rapidly decarbonizing our industrial, transportation, energy, and other critical sectors, consistent with the best available science, and as a guide to necessary international leadership. In other words, to hear from America. Regrettably, however, in mid-September, the agency rejected our petition, citing, among other things, its thought that under the recently passed Inflation Adjustment Act, and action under other law, it was and would be doing enough to meet the Biden administration's goals on climate. Needless to say, the petitioners do not think that the agency and the United States government generally are yet doing enough on climate. We need more action, stronger action, dare I say, that is bolder. By way of procedure here, we will hear the considered thoughts first of our individual petitioners, and then that of pre-registered speakers. Each pre-registered speaker will have 5 minutes to present. And then we will take a break. And after that, we will hear from persons who registered here in person, and they will have 2 minutes each to speak. I'll introduce the petitioners, but for those who follow, if you would please provide some relevant information on you before you begin with your thoughts, that would be helpful. I should also say that we did invite the Environmental Protection Agency to attend today's meeting, but I received word both from EPA headquarters in Region 8 that the agency is not able to attend, However, we aim to create a full record of today's hearing for the agency's consideration and indeed reconsideration on the question whether the United States should be doing more on climate. And now to the petitioners. Leading off our hearing, they will be in order: James Hansen, Donn Viviani, John Birks, Richard Heede, and Lise van Susteren. And so to our first petitioner, speaker, Dr. James Hansen. He is the former director of the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies and the current director of Climate Science Awareness and Solutions, a program of the Earth Institute at Columbia University in New York City. Dr. Hansen is the author of Storms of My Grandchildren and the forthcoming Sophie's Planet. He's also the principal author or co-author of numerous papers on the subject of climate change and Earth's energy imbalance. Dr. Hansen is perhaps best known for his testimony on climate change to congressional committees in the 1980s that helped raise broad awareness of the global warming issue. His recent research establishes that humanity's fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions have already raised Earth's temperature well beyond the safe level, imposing an increasingly untenable burden on young people. His research also raises the prospect that continued high fossil fuel emissions will melt the planet's major ice sheets at a nonlinear rate. On the other hand, in his work, Dr. Hansen has helped specify the magnitude and rate of decarbonization required to preserve a habitable climate, and he has highlighted the potential utility of certain methods and policies for deep decarbonization and large-scale CO2 removal with important co-benefits. So I'll turn now to Dr. Hansen.
Okay, can you see me and hear me now?
Yes, thank you very much, Jim.
Oh, great. Okay, well, thanks very much for letting me have a few minutes. I will use them to discuss the global warming situation today in 2022. And specifically, I want to comment first on why it is so difficult to get the actions that are needed to address climate change, even though on the face of it, the needed actions make sense for many reasons. The fundamental climate physics is very simple. When we add infrared absorbing gases to the air, we throw planet Earth temporarily out of energy balance because the gases act like a blanket that temporarily reduces heat radiation to space. So with more energy coming in than going out, Earth begins to warm up, but it takes time because of the tremendous thermal inertia of the ocean. 85 to 90% of the excess energy is going into the ocean. Now we have several thousand deep diving Argo floats distributed around the global ocean, which allow us to measure Earth's energy imbalance by measuring the rate at which heat is accumulating in the global ocean. And the result of the measurements is that they show Earth is gaining energy at a rate that means there's still more global warming already in the pipeline. Earth observed warming in the past century is already 1.2 degrees Celsius, which is 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and over land that's about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. But it is the delayed response of the climate that causes the biggest problem. People are just beginning to see the impacts of global warming, but there is much more warming in the pipeline, which and greater climate impacts, unless we take actions to reverse the human-made climate forcing. And despite what you may have heard from some politicians, we have not taken actions that address the core problem. On the contrary, Earth's energy imbalance is increasing now, and the rate of warming is rising. So let me mention just the two greatest potential climate impacts if we allow them to occur. These are the impacts that constitute an existential threat. The first is the global sea level rise. If we let greenhouse gases continue to increase, we will sentence today's young people to a rising sea level that's out of their control. During the next 50 to 100 years, we will begin losing coastal cities. And more than half of the world's largest cities are on coastlines. The second impact is the fact that low latitudes will become increasingly less habitable. The subtropics in the summer and the tropics in much of the year are becoming too hot for work or recreation outdoors. The net effect could be a pressure for immigration from coastal areas and low latitudes that makes the world practically ungovernable if we allow greenhouse gas emissions to continue at a high level. Now, these global threats will affect everyone, even people living in high latitudes and high altitudes. And in addition, global warming causes extreme climate events, floods, storms, heat waves, and fires to become more extreme, almost everywhere. So we cannot pretend that we do not understand the delayed climate response and that our continued failure to act will sentence young people to a bleaker future, a less hospitable planet than the one that we enjoy. But there's no good reason for that to occur. The actions that are needed to move to a bright future for young people make sense for many reasons. If we make the price of energies honest by stopping subsidies of fossil fuels and putting a price on carbon emissions, we can spur innovation and economic development and ensure a good future for young people. So thanks for listening and considering support for our initiative. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hansen. Really appreciate it. Before we go to our next speaker, I should have also introduced Nelson Bonner to my left. He is on the CPR Initiative Board of Directors, and he is our timekeeper today. And if you are speaking, he will provide you with a warning of 30 seconds before your 5-minute allotment is up. Kaylee Martin is also with our organization, and she will be assisting people at the break who are needing to still sign up to make a statement after the break. Okay, now as to our next speaker, he is Donn Viviani. Donn is also a co-petitioner along with Dr. Hansen and the others that I mentioned, and who will be following Donn. Donn is a retired Environmental Protection Agency scientist. Donn, you can make your way to the podium if you wish. He was at the EPA for 35 years, during which time he also served as the director of its climate policy evaluation department, and over the course of his work there, he ran other divisions and branches in every media at the agency. Donn also served as chairman of, during that time, of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board Toxics Committee, and as a member of the International Joint Commission Science Coordinating Committee. He holds a Ph.D. in physical organic chemistry, and he lives in Oahu, and also serves as the CPR Initiative Board President. Donn.
Okay, hi. Just for the record, I want to assure everybody that I won't be anywhere as interesting or compelling as Dr. Hansen was, or possibly anybody else who's speaking after me. But back when I was when I was director of the Climate Policy Assessment Division, I was concerned about climate change, but I was reasonably sure it was fixable. I'm not worried anymore. I'm actually just plain terrified. In the 90s, I was worried about my children. In the 90s, I was worried about any grandkids I might have. Right now, I'm worried about my kids, and they're in their 40s. So everything's crept a lot closer. There's still hope, but not with today's half measures. Half fixing the climate, which is what we're sort of doing now, is sort of like half swimming the English Channel. In either case, if you don't finish the job, you're really screwed. Let's hope we can finish the job. To finish the job, we need to do two things. First thing is we need to drastically cut emissions, and that's not happening. We are cutting them, but not fast enough. And the other thing that's really important is we have to draw down all of the overburden of carbon that's up there, that we've put up there over the years. It's acting as a heat engine, as Jim talked about, and it's burning the land, and it's expanding the oceans. It's also acidifying them, deoxygenating them, TSCA is the only authority that can require both cutting emissions and drawing down legacy carbon. Why is that, and how would that work? Well, first of all, TSCA is a Chemical Safety Act. TSCA is designed to keep us safe from unreasonable risks to human health and the environment from chemicals over the entire life cycle of the chemical, from when you produce it to when it's disposed of. CO2 right now is the most unsafe chemical that has ever existed. We've dumped so much greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, we're now dancing at the edge of an abyss, and we need to step away. Under TSCA, TSCA requires EPA to regulate unreasonable risks from these chemicals. EPA is a science agency. Measuring risk is what EPA does. Controlling chemical risk from all parts is what TSCA does. The science of that risk isn't really fancy. It's the physics of your microwave oven and the chemistry of your soda stream machine. There are no microwave oven deniers. Everybody agrees that the science is there. What about the risk? Climate change and ocean acidification are both existential risks. Existential risks, if they're avoidable, have to be considered unreasonable. The petition just asks EPA to do its damn job. Control the chemical risk that threatens our future under a congressionally approved authority. There's no need to genuflect to any senators or anybody else. It's the president's call. Unfortunately, EPA denied our petition. At EPA, I've written a few denials, and I've reviewed a lot more. My sense was the instructions were deny this petition, find some good reasons. And they did. They found a bunch of reasons, and they wrote them down, and they held them all together with a staple. They basically said, don't worry, we have this under control. Saying something like that is what you say to your spouse when she yells at you because you're standing on a stool to change a light bulb. It's not what you say to reassure the country that you've got a problem that's threatening the planet under control. EPA just can't assert this, but without laying out how it's under control. Our petition lays out how you can get it under control. A carbon fee and legacy drawdown. EPA's current plans don't include either of those. The denial does refer to the IRA and a bunch of other good intentions and things that they're doing. And EPA will cut emissions through the IRA, but not enough. The IRA pays people rich enough to have a tax liability to decarbonize, and it uses taxpayer money. But it also allows industry and, for example, power companies to continue to pollute and use their fossil fuels as long as they cut down on the margin a little bit of their carbon emissions through things like carbon capture technology. If I was a cynic, I would call this governmental greenwashing. It's not going to be near enough. EPA knows it, and if they really believed it, they would have shown how they were going to solve this problem. In 2015, I petitioned EPA to regulate CO2 because of ocean impacts. The petition showed that ocean warming, ocean acidification, and ocean deoxygenation was threatening the collapse of the marine food web. And it was obviously an unreasonable risk. EPA denied that petition and said, like today, don't worry, we have a plan. There was no plan, and it's gotten worse since then. There's no secret plan this time either. The risk is real and imminent. EPA has the authority under TSCA to set a carbon price and require polluters to clean up their mess and draw down the pollution. EPA just needs the political will, or as Jim said, the courage to use that authority, and I hope they will. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Donn. And I should also note that the petition itself is available for anyone to review at cprclimate.org.
And to additionally support.
Yes, and to additionally support if people are interested. Now, our next speaker is John Birks, if he can make his way to the microphone. John Birks is a co-petitioner. He is the chief scientist at 2B Technologies here in Boulder, Colorado. It's a company that he co-founded in 1998 that develops and manufactures new products for air quality measurements. He's also a professor emeritus at the University of Colorado, where he and his graduate students carried out research in atmospheric chemistry for 25 years. He's best known for his work in quantifying the rates of chemical reactions that caused the Antarctic ozone hole, his development of the nuclear winter theory with Paul Crutzen in 1982, and the development of miniaturized instruments for air pollution measurements. His current research is focused on the use of low-cost sensors for mobile monitoring of air pollutants in cities, and an outgrowth of the AQ TREX educational outreach programs that his company implemented in several hundred schools around the United States. And John lives here in Boulder, Colorado. John.
Thank you. Good morning. First, I'd like to thank all of you for being here and thank the many speakers who have agreed to testify today. I especially want to thank the other atmospheric scientists who agreed to take time away from their teaching and research today to provide their input on this critically important problem. I've lived in the Boulder area for more than 45 years. First as an atmospheric chemistry professor at the University of Colorado for 25 years, and for the past 20 years running, as Dan mentioned, a small technology company I co-founded to develop, market, sell new instruments for air pollution measurements. This business experience has provided me with some insights that I lacked as a professor of how the real world works to some extent, and an appreciation for how important it is to include the business perspective in making decisions about the environment. There are an enormous number of things that need to be done if the U.S. and the world are to solve the climate crisis, but like a large majority of economists, I believe that instituting a rising carbon fee would have the greatest positive impact. A carbon fee would be imposed at the source or on downstream products and would start low, raising the price of gasoline, for example, by a few cents initially, and slowly rising to make renewable energy sources like solar, wind, tide, nuclear, and geothermal increasingly more competitive, and thereby encouraging investments in those technologies, including investment by the current fossil fuel companies. Some oil and gas companies, including ExxonMobil, have long stated that they're in favor of a carbon fee, and yet we don't have one. There are several proposals for use of the revenue raised through a carbon fee. The revenue could be used to fund R&D for alternative energy technologies, for example, used to establish a carbon market that provides income to companies that remove legacy carbon by natural means, such as planting trees, or by using removal technologies that are currently under development. Or, in the carbon fee and dividend approach, the revenue could be refunded to the public on a per capita or other basis, bearing in mind that disposal of these pollutants into the atmosphere and oceans affects the well-being of each and every one of us. If distributed on a per capita basis, including children, it could help provide a basic income that would especially benefit the poorest Americans. A carbon fee would not only drive the transition to an economy based on renewable energy in the U.S., if it were applied to the imports as it would need to be, it would help to do the same for countries around the world, since we are the world's largest consumer market, consuming twice that of the European Union and 3 times that of China. In fact, with only 5% of the world population, the U.S. consumes more than 1/3 of the world's goods. Predictability is very important in the business world. Based on my experience in business, albeit a small business, I am optimistic that large sectors of the fossil fuel, agriculture, manufacturing, and other industries would be willing to work with scientists and government agencies to develop a carbon fee structure, and possibly other economic approaches to achieve net zero emissions and eventually drawdown of some fraction of legacy CO2 by mid-century. When businesses know what the rules are, they find ways to adapt to those rules while continuing to make a profit. Dr. Chris Ennis will speak later about how a partnership between academia, government, and industry resulted in the successful phase-out of CFCs and other ozone-depleting gases. The CFC problem was orders of magnitude smaller than the problem we face with greenhouse gases today, but nevertheless a model that worked and that could provide a starting point for the global change problem. In summary, we need the EPA to do their job by beginning to regulate greenhouse gases in the same way that they have regulated other air pollutants for decades. And we need a partnership between scientists, government agencies, and industry if we are to solve this existential threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And I might also note here, following your remarks about our experience with CFCs, that in 1978, the United States commenced the phase-out of CFCs through use of the Toxic Substances Control Act. Our next speaker is pre-recorded. He is Rick Heede. I'll provide an introduction now, and then his statement, which he taped for us on Sunday, since he cannot be here today, will be played. Richard Heede leads the Climate Accountability Institute. He serves as the principal investigator for its widely cited Carbon Majors project, which traces historical CO2 emissions to oil, natural gas, and coal companies. Rick has authored and co-authored several papers on the climate responsibilities of fossil fuel producers. In 2011, he co-founded the Climate Accountability Institute to provide the scientific basis for leveraging climate stewardship by carbon producers. He published his thesis, A Geography of Carbon, with the National Center for Atmospheric Research in 1984. He's worked on energy and climate solutions with the Rocky Mountain Institute and founded Climate Mitigation Services in 2003. His passive solar rammed earth home in Aspen cuts carbon emissions by 2/3. He is a co-petitioner, and we are pleased to have him join here by pre-recorded message.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome to citizens of Boulder. I'm pleased to be here today. And citizens of Boulder know better than almost anyone else in the country what the costs of climate change are, from the Marshall Fire and from floods and other destabilizing events in and around Boulder and Colorado. And most of us are aware that global CO2 emissions are rising. We still have not peaked emissions, even though we've had now Conference of the Parties under the UN international meetings to deal with climate change since the late 1990s. And we're about to go to Egypt for the 27th meeting of COP. And the United States signed in 1992 the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that acknowledged that we have common but differentiated responsibilities to accept that we should take the lead on reducing emissions globally, that because climate change is primarily driven by cumulative carbon emissions, and the United States has historically contributed 25% of global emissions since the beginning of the industrial era. So that obliges this country to take the lead among other wealthy countries. And US per capita emissions are about 20 tons per year. Citizens of Boulder have done an inventory, and the average per capita emissions are about 13 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And so we're doing better in Boulder than the US average, but we have much work to do. And City Council has acknowledged and agreed that the City of Boulder should reduce its emissions by 70% by 2030, and a very aggressive and ambitious move to cut emissions to net zero by 2035. So I applaud Boulder for taking the lead and reducing its own emissions. And with the federal Inflation Reduction Acts passed by Congress a couple of months ago, the country has taken an aggressive stance nationally to reduce emissions through renewable energy, through other safe energy forms, to subsidize and give incentives to sustainable aviation fuel and agriculture, and grants for improving building energy use and industry energy use, and to transition this economy away from fossil fuels over time. That's an important step forward. We don't yet know if those measures, costing us about $370 billion over 10 years, will be sufficient, but they are certainly a huge step forward. Now, in my view, it's not simply up to taxpayers and the federal government, even though they have huge responsibilities in this arena to reduce emissions and veer away from fossil fuels altogether by the mid-century. But some of the responsibility lies with fossil fuel companies themselves, who have for years deceived the public about the nature of climate science and the responsibility of fossil fuel companies and fossil fuels in general as being the prime mover of anthropogenic or human-caused climate change. So I think some of the responsibility falls on companies, and that's the reason I formed the Carbon Majors Initiative at Climate Accountability Institute many years ago, and we have developed a database that tracks, based on industry's own information, company information, how much fossil fuels each company produced each year, going back to as early as the 1850s. So now we have a database of 108 companies, how much carbon they produced and how much ends up in the atmosphere by year and by gas, so that we can trace each company's responsibility in terms of how much they have contributed to atmospheric CO2 concentration. And we work with scientists to then estimate what the temperature rise and sea level rise is attributable to each of those companies. In aggregate, those 108 entities are responsible for almost 70% of all fossil fuel emissions since 1750. And the leading companies contribute something on the order of 3 or 4% of that total over time. Boulder has taken the aggressive step, along with San Miguel County and Boulder County, to file litigation against 2 oil companies to recover damages and costs of dealing with climate change. And similar suits have been filed in about 24 different jurisdictions around the US and even in Germany, and there's other litigation around the world. So I applaud Boulder for taking that step, and the citizens of Boulder, as well as the city itself, can support our petition, of which I'm associated on a personal basis, by urging the EPA to grant our petition and set in motion the process to reduce and phase out fossil fuel emissions by 2050, and to take responsibility for removing legacy emissions. And some of my work on carbon majors might help inform how much each company is obliged to reduce in order to limit greenhouse gas warming hopefully to 1.5 degrees centigrade, and to reduce atmospheric concentration to 350 parts per million, instead of the current and rising emissions now at about 418 parts per million. So thanks for Boulder to taking the lead, both in terms of reducing its own emissions and to go up against the fossil fuel industry and its deceptive strategies. And they have spent years and decades and millions of dollars to disinform the public and the Congress in order to delay action on climate change. And these companies are now rolling in profits from the high gasoline prices. And ExxonMobil alone declared profits of almost $20 billion in the last quarter. And so windfall profits tax might also be appropriate in this regard. But in my view, these companies bear substantial responsibility for addressing the climate problem and the climate crisis that they helped spawn and that they knew decades ago would lead to climate damages. And here we are. So we must move forward. Boulder, aim high, and thanks for all you do.
Rick, really appreciate.
Okay, we really appreciate Rick Heede's willingness to provide us with this statement. He talked quite a bit about fossil fuel companies. I will note for the record that we did reach out to some representatives in the fossil fuel industry to also be with us today to testify, but they were not able to attend. Our last petitioner who will be testifying today is Lise van Susteren. Dr. Susteren is a practicing general and forensic psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., and an expert on the physical and mental health effects of climate disruption. She has served on the advisory board of the Center for Health and the Global Environment at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and is co-founder of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance. Dr. Hansen co-founded the, yeah, I'm sorry. Dr. Susteren, 13 years ago, co-convened the first gathering of experts to discuss the unfolding crisis and its future impacts on the mental health of the public. In 2011, she co-authored The Psychological Effects of Climate Warming on the United States, Why the United States Mental Health System is Not Prepared. So, Dr. van Susteren.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for allowing me to speak. In denying our petition to declare CO2 a toxic substance, start video, sorry. There we go. In denying our petition to declare CO2 a toxic substance, what exactly is the EPA suggesting? Are they saying CO2 doesn't present an unreasonable risk of harm? Are they saying that despite having our backs to the wall, approaching irreversible thresholds, despite bipartisan legislation fully empowering the EPA to begin rulemaking to regulate current and clean up legacy emissions, that they want to do the equivalent of sitting this one out? What do the leaders at the EPA think young people who will bear the brunt of bad decisions hear in the denial of this petition? I have spent hours face to face with young people talking about their distress at government half measures. They know the numbers don't add up. They know we aren't near the reductions that are needed. They see what's happening. They know they are not safe. They tell me they will not have children because of the carbon costs of adding to the population, and because they would feel it would be immoral, given the conditions they expect, to bring a child into such a chaotic world. Some see no point in pursuing higher education in a world they don't expect will exist much longer. One told me about friends discussing rational suicide. I have watched tears being swept away, bodies stuck rigid in a tense, awkward silence. I have heard and felt anger rise up, filling the room with righteous outrage that government doesn't care enough to do what it takes to save them. In a study of which I'm co-author, published in The Lancet in the fall of 2021, 10,000 young people aged 16 to 25 from around the world, the US, UK, Brazil, Finland, the Philippines, France, Portugal, Nigeria, India, and Australia, reported on their climate distress. They have no illusions. They know what is happening. 3/4 reported they are frightened about climate change. More than half say it affects their daily lives. Nearly half feel they are doomed. A full 2/3 lay the blame squarely at the feet of government. They know. They don't live in a cave. They know government is abandoning them. They know politics and profits are being put ahead of the health of the public. And they know it doesn't have to be this way. From studies of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, we know that trauma, particularly repeated trauma, can cause lifelong increased morbidity and mortality. Experiencing extreme weather events, or even just hearing about them, can exact a serious emotional toll, causing PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and cognitive impacts. That is, problems with memory, concentration, impulse control, and judgment. These impacts prime for future distress. And the greater the number of incidents, the worse it is. Deaths of despair are surging. The factors are complex, but believing you may not have a future and knowing how contagious behaviors can be in young people is deeply worrisome. Some young people struggle with pre-traumatic stress, like PTSD, as they imagine future harms. And the dangers to our democracy from insufficient action on climate are not being taken seriously enough. What form of government may come to dominate? As a former psychological profiler for the federal government, I do not say those words lightly. For when people are afraid, they regress. They often express their fears as anger. They are prone to scapegoating and even demonizing others they see as different. It fuels polarization, feeds conspiracy theories, because holding them feels empowering. In times of peril and scarcity, we can see a rise in authoritarian government because people turn to what they perceive as strong leaders to protect them. They become prey, ready to give up their freedoms in exchange for the promise of perceived security. Heaven help us from the tyrants, the bullies, I used to say could be unleashed, but now I have to say have been unleashed. The sine qua non of stable society is belief in our institutions. Fundamental to that confidence is that our institutions operate on the basis of facts and the law. In this era of crisis, the EPA may well be at the center of what humanity holds, of what ultimately holds humanity together. The belief that intelligent, honest individuals who respect the facts and the law are making good decisions, and that they give us reason to have hope. The EPA must not sit this one out. We have too much to lose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Susteren, for that statement. Our next series of speakers will be here in person. As you come up again, please identify yourself and your professional affiliation before beginning to speak. And remember to lean into the microphone so that your statement is amply recorded for the record. The first person is Jose Jimenez. Is he here? Okay, and we will return to people who are not here in a bit. The next listed speaker is Joost de Gouw. Is Joost available? Okay, he too is likely on his way. Next on our list is Richard Rood. Very good. Thank you, Richard.
Good
Welcome.
morning. My name is Richard Rood. I'm a resident of Boulder County. I'm also on the faculty at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and teach climate science and climate change problem solving. I worked at NASA for 20 years, actually as a colleague of Jim Hansen until 2005. We're living in a time of rapid global warming. The warming has been accelerating in recent decades, and we expect it to continue to warm for the foreseeable future. Even if we intervene effectively to limit the warming, we will continue to live on a planet that is warmer than that of our parents and grandparents. Presently, climate is changing so fast that each decade is a different climate. We are ill-prepared both practically and emotionally for dealing with persistent change. Since 2020, the United States has taken important, meaningful legislative actions to address climate change. These steps include the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Collectively, this legislation places large amounts of money in many of the right places to begin to address the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. In the best of circumstances, they are important steps in addressing climate change. However, they are only at the start of what will need to be an enduring effort to both reduce greenhouse gases and to adapt to the warming planet. We rarely achieve the best of circumstances in the implementation of policies, legislation, and regulation. All the pieces never quite fit together. There are loopholes that have been made to built in to gain political support. Those loopholes are also vulnerabilities that invite litigation and can, in fact, build in policy and practice that are in the long term detrimental. Examples might be the U.S. policies on corn ethanol and the bargains that we have made replacing coal with natural gas. My purpose in speaking today is to support strengthening in law the control of greenhouse gases. It was only in 2007 that the Supreme Court ruled that the Environmental Protection Agency could regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant. Though the recent West Virginia versus EPA decision did not suggest that the court is inviting challenges to the 2007 ruling, it did demonstrate the difficulty of taking action to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. It showed the peril of relying on executive orders for climate policy. It revealed how footholds for litigation that cause years of delays are, in some cases, built into the system. The Inflation Reduction Act establishes in law the ability to regulate carbon dioxide and methane. However, like the Affordable Care Act, we might reasonably expect a hostile future Congress to try to repeal it. We might expect legal challenges to parts of the bill, and we can imagine people looking for ways to erode the 2007 decision that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Indeed, it is not outside the realm of reason to expect challenges to the Clean Air Act itself. I signed the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative's petition to the EPA because I saw it as a way to strengthen the statement that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. That petition used the Toxic Substances Control Act and would codify that carbon dioxide is responsible for an unreasonable risk of injury to health and to the environment. Though the acts passed by Congress are major steps forward, they are by no means a definitive final word. There are many things that the U.S. still needs to do. Though analysis of the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act shows substantial and important reductions in greenhouse gases, those reductions are not enough, and they have yet to be realized. We need to realize that these important laws are near the beginning of the solution path. We need to be aware of efforts to divert us from that path And part of that awareness is to continue to establish and shore up the fact that carbon dioxide is a dangerous pollutant that is leading to unreasonable risk to health and safety.
Thank you very much, Richard. Appreciate your comments. Is Chris Ennis here? Yes. Thank you very much, Ms. Ennis, your statement.
Good morning. My name is Chris Ennis. I came to Boulder in 1979 as a graduate student in John Birks' group and have been working as an atmospheric scientist since then at NCAR, at NOAA in association with the University of Colorado and CIRES, and now at 2B Technologies. In climate change, we face an enormous challenge that is global, economically pervasive, and both immediate and long-term in its effects. There is precedent for the world addressing a global environmental challenge. We've come together to protect the stratospheric ozone layer through the United Nations Montreal Protocol. The drawdown and eventual phase-out of refrigerants like CFCs and other ozone-depleting substances has been achieved because of this agreement signed by all the world's nations. For 22 years, I had a front-row seat to that achievement as the coordinator of the scientific assessment reports that informed the process. I got to see how and why the process worked. The ozone layer protection succeeded because of partnership that involves scientists, decision makers, and industry. Science informed the decisions, of course, but so did industry and the realities of what could be achieved to develop alternatives to the CFCs. Progress was in stages, with the steps informed not only by science, but technology, economics, and societal factors. DuPont and others in industry were fully engaged in the process and vested, indeed proud of, the solutions that emerged. The lesson learned in the case of the ozone layer is this: success rests on a three-legged stool. For global environmental issues, those legs are science, policymakers, industry. And the stool can only stand if it has all three legs. For the climate issue, there are two legs that are a little bit wobbly. In fact, they need to be significantly strengthened. First, policymakers in all nations, like the EPA in the United States, need to step up their game. The Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative presents a compelling case for how the EPA should use the existing framework of the Toxic Substances Control Act to regulate greenhouse gases. I'm grateful for and in fact in awe of the people who have led this initiative. As Nike would say, EPA, just do it. And industry must be more strongly drawn into the process as a key part of the solution. This is the second wobbly leg. It was shoulder to shoulder working between industry, science, and decision makers for the ozone issue. The same model needs to be used now for climate. Now, the ozone layer issue was at first a puzzle, and the appearance of the ozone hole kind of flummoxed everyone and was a surprise to scientists in the 1980s. The climate change is an even greater challenge, but what it is not is a puzzle. We know its causes. The science is clear. And we know the several paths that must be taken to its solution. It's time for decision makers and industry to act, and act boldly on this knowledge. The atmosphere and our descendants will remember for a century or more what we do now and what we do not. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ennis, for that clarion call. Is Jeff Bennett here? Mr. Bennett, thank you for coming forward.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeff Bennett. I live here in Boulder. I am an astronomer by training. Got my Ph.D. here at CU, but I've been teaching about global warming in the context of my astronomy classes for 40 years. I've written a book and I have a website on the topic of global warming to explain the basic science. And I'll be speaking about it at Fisk Planetarium on Thursday and Friday night, so hopefully some of you will come. The previous speakers have really kind of covered everything that I thought I would talk about here today. But so what I want to do is just give you a little brief exercise, particularly for those at the EPA and in positions to make these policy, to think about what our potential futures are, and particularly with some of the comments of Dr. Susteren in mind of what this is doing to young people today. And so if you think 50 years from now, look at the year 2072. And, you know, for people like me, that doesn't even seem like a time when I'll be alive. But for today's kids, they will be younger than many of us in this room at that time. This is their future 50 years from now. This is when they'll be in the prime of their lives. And I think what's been made very, very clear by the science, by Dr. Hansen, by others here, by the UN report that you referenced, if we just leave things as they are, it will be a very bleak world for these kids today. But that is not the only possibility. We understand how to deal with this problem. We have the technology to replace our fossil fuels with other energies sources that do not contribute to this problem. We have the technology on the way to begin to draw the level back down, as Dr. Hansen talked about. We could imagine easily that if we act very quickly to stop our carbon emissions now, that buys us a little time to develop newer technologies, perhaps nuclear fusion, others, that would then allow us to start drawing the carbon dioxide level back down. It's actually possible to imagine that in the 2070s, today's kids will be living in what I like to call a post-global warming world, where we will have already brought the carbon dioxide levels significantly back down to the point where instead of dealing with all those lag problems that Dr. Hansen talked about, we've actually begun to restore the climate so that it's better than it is today. That same energy would give us the ability to do so much more. Energy is a key to alleviating poverty. If we have lots of clean energy available, we can not only draw the carbon level back down and restore the climate, we could eliminate poverty around the world. We could do all kinds of amazing things. We could stop mining around the world because we'd have the energy to go get resources from space. You could have most of the Earth turned into a national park. The future in the years in the 2070s could look so amazing that what science fiction writers at their best, most optimistic talk about wouldn't even begin to describe it. Our kids do not have to face a future that's bleak or bleaker. It's bleak or it's amazing if we act correctly today. And so what I'd ask everybody at the EPA who's dealing with this issue, all of our lawmakers to do, is a little exercise that I recommend to people called writing a letter to your grandchildren. Write a letter in which you say, I've heard about all these things. I hope you live in a good world. Here is what I've decided to do about it. And you seal it in a time capsule for 50 years. When they open that letter 50 years from now in the 2070s, will they thank you for having made that amazing world, or will they blame you for having let it not happen? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that very, very far-reaching statement. I will write that letter as well. Is Kathleen Sands with us today? Okay, not yet. So then back to have Jose Jimenez. Is Jose Jimenez yet back? No. Or Yaus de Gao? Okay, so then we are going to move to some of our remote speakers. And the first one, and I'm going to move up in order to accommodate his late-breaking schedule, is Ross Salowich. Can we bring Ross up online?
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I will do my best to stick to the points here. I wish I was in Boulder, of course, but the carbon footprint of flying to Boulder for this would not make sense. I'm going to do my very best to complement rather than repeat what was said by others and what I'm sure will be said by future folks that talk today. I'm going to talk about 3 topics, each of which my group at the University of Maryland, where I'm a professor of atmospheric chemistry and climate, has done research on. The first is something we call the climate penalty factor. That is that air pollution is the greatest during summer, worst during summer, and it turns out that air pollution is the greatest single human factor in terms of human years of life lost, which is rather stunning. So we've published several papers showing that surface ozone, that's bad ozone, displays a rather strong correlation with surface temperature. These papers led by Brian Bloomer, who works at the EPA in GRL 2009, by Linda Hembeck in Atmospheric Environment in 2022, recent work, shows that when it gets hot out, ozone is worse, and there's lots of speculation as to why that is, or thought about why that is. It's chemistry and it's weather. And of course, as we all know, CO2 drives the rise in surface temperature. So this is very, very clear in the data record and is another reason why EPA should consider regulating CO2 direct connection to human health. Okay, I'm going to switch attention and talk to methane. Methane, as we all know, is the second most important anthropogenic and human greenhouse gas. It's 84 times more potent than CO2 on a per mass basis over a 20-year time horizon. The US has a commitment under our president to reduce our emissions of methane in year 2030 by 30% relative to what we emitted in year 2020. My research group at University of Maryland has shown, as have many other research groups throughout the US, prodigious leakage of methane from landfills. This is low-hanging fruit. These are landfills with active capture systems for methane that aren't doing their job. Okay, 2 points. One, state of Maryland, where I work and live, has adopted the GWP, Global Warming Potential Methane, on the 20-year time horizon. We have a new regulation called ComAir 261142 to control methane emissions from municipal solid waste landfills. The 3 leading states for this are Oregon, California, and Maryland. We're actually using EPA methodology to do this. So the states are taking the lead in this. President Biden has gone, staked a promise on this. Why isn't the EPA stepping up? Okay, third and final area is nitrous oxide N2O, kind of the lost gas in here. I'm gonna connect nitrous oxide to the stratosphere. And great testimony, Chris. It's pleasure working with you on those ozone assessments. Okay, so it turns out that nitrous oxide is the ozone depleting substance of the 21st century. What does that mean? Well, in 2020, we've showed in the executive summary of the 2022 update, or 2022 Scientific Assessment of Ozone Depletion report, that emissions of nitrous oxide, when weighted by something we call the ozone depletion potential, were more than 2 times the human emissions globally of all CFCs. Okay, 2 times all CFCs. Now, the chemistry of nitrous oxide is complex, as is the sources. Well, the sources are due to agriculture, and controlling it is a big challenge. I really like, again, what Chris Ennis said about industry coming together to work with scientists. Okay, the chemistry is complex because the ozone depletion potential of nitrous oxide depends also on methane. My group has tried to work this out. We published a paper in 2015 led by Laura Ravel in GRL, documenting, despite the complexities, the ability to compute the ozone depletion potential of nitrous oxide. And as I speak, right now in Montreal is the 34th meeting of the parties of the Montreal Protocol, and I'm sure they're talking about nitrous oxide because we know that right now this is the greatest human contributor to the future health of our very protective stratospheric ozone layer. Thank you all. Good luck. I've really enjoyed this. Have a great rest of the session.
Thank you very much, and I want to remind speakers and others that you can submit additional written testimony and the scientific documents on which you have relied or mentioned or otherwise think should be part of the record to us at cprclimate.org/written-testimony. So please make use of that opportunity as well. Thank you very much. Let me mention the next three speakers so that people can be ready. They will be Rob Jackson, John Fitzgerald, and Ken Bousseleur. So the first, and they are all speaking remotely. Rob Jackson, please, of Stanford University.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you, everyone, for attending and for the other speakers. My name is Rob Jackson. First of all, love to my son, Will, who's a UC Boulder senior, in case you're listening, Will. I'm also a professor of energy and environment in Stanford's New Door School of Sustainability, and I chair the Global Carbon Project, an international group of scientists who track carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and other greenhouse gases. As you've heard from other speakers, the scientific consensus is crystal clear. Climate change is real, here, already dangerous. Billion-dollar weather disasters are costing Americans $100 billion more a year now than they were just a few decades ago. We're paying for climate change already. First answer to the question, what can we do then, is to reduce fossil fuel use faster than we have been. Colorado's renewable electricity use has tripled over the last decade. That's not just helping the environment, it's saving lives and money. Fossil fuel pollution kills more than 1 million people worldwide and 100,000 Americans each year. But we need action in other parts of our economy too. Emissions in the US are dominated by transportation. Electrifying our vehicles will save lives, money, and the climate. Incentives for electric cars and other vehicles are critical for maintaining a safe, livable climate. We need cheaper electric cars and more convenient charging stations. Today, though, I want to highlight the importance of methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent pound for pound than carbon dioxide. Methane concentrations in our air aren't just rising, they're rising faster than ever before. Methane's the second most important greenhouse gas globally and the best lever we have for reducing peak temperatures over the next decade or two. So how do we reduce methane emissions? First and foremost, use less oil, coal, and gas. My group's work this year showed that gas appliances in our homes leak methane even when they're off, and that stoves release dangerous levels of NOx pollution into kitchen air. NOx is an asthma trigger for our kids and elderly in particular. For this reason, home and building electrification is one of the most immediate things we can do, once again for our livelihoods as well as for climate. So turn off the gas meter to your homes. My group's work with Nathan Phillips of Boston University also provided the first public maps of natural gas leaks in cities. We drove cities block by block, back and forth like a lawnmower. We mapped thousands of leaks across Boston, Washington, D.C., and New York. Every one of them a climate risk, every one of them an explosion risk. We also mapped cities like Cincinnati and Durham, North Carolina, where public-private partnerships cut street leaks by 90% over a decade of improved maintenance, creating jobs and making us safer. We can't tackle methane pollution without also looking at agriculture, though. Not everyone knows that cows and manures emit as much methane as the oil and gas industry globally. Our dietary choices matter. So eat less beef and waste less food. Get your schools and companies to encourage vegetarian meals, as always for the climate and for our health. Throw less stuff away and reduce methane emissions from landfills. My colleague John Fitzgerald will speak next, and I suspect highlight the importance of methane action. Good things are happening. As you just heard, the Global Methane Pledge is an important first step. I'm also excited about the new satellites launching over the next year or two. They'll uncover the world's super emitters. But they won't be enough. We need individual actions, city and state action, and of course, national action to reduce methane emissions. We need the EPA to do its job. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that statement. Now, if we could bring forth John Fitzgerald. Appreciate your statement, John. Is John with us? Do you know?
Yes, I am.
Very good. Hi, John.
Hello, Dan.
Welcome.
And I must say, that was Rob Jackson, not John. And thank you, Rob, for that very good summary. As Rob noted, I am counsel to Methane Action. I'm also vice president of the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative. I happen also to be on the executive committee of the Sierra Club of the state of Maine chapter and on the National Conservation Policy Advisory Committee. And finally, I serve on the board of the Environmental Investigation Agency, which specializes in undercover detection of environmental crimes. And in fact, they pinned down the source of CFC leaks in northwestern China, which had been identified by satellite, but they went undercover and found exactly where they were coming from. I'm going to tell you three things today. One, that I've spent my career identifying and correcting unreasonable risks to human health and the environment. So I know an unreasonable risk when I see one, and that is what EPA has to determine. Number two, that the federal government and the EPA in particular have both the duty and the tools to reduce that risk and restore the climate if they act now and begin to develop and deploy the technologies that are being developed in laboratories in Denmark and MIT and other places as we speak. And number three, that the citizens of Boulder and the communities in every democracy also have the duty and the tools to reduce that risk and restore the climate if they guide their elected officials and the institutions of which they are a part or member to help carry out that climate restoration. So, in summary, I'll try to highlight some of those things. The fact of the matter is, in terms of identifying unreasonable risks, that was my job at U.S. Agency for International Development in reviewing World Bank proposed projects and flagging those that could present a risk to human health, the environment, or indigenous peoples. We did that and reported on continuing violations of the Pelosi Amendment, which was designed to report those in environmental impact statements before the bank's projects were voted on by U.S. Treasury. That was ignored. I was removed from my job. I filed a whistleblower protection appeal and won after 2 years of litigation. So, in essence, that was my job, to do what EPA is supposed to do here in identifying an unreasonable risk to human health and the environment, which is the continued, unabated, and not very well controlled use of fossil fuels. We can't get rid of them overnight, but we can certainly plan our way out. The point I want to make is that the EPA and the president have the tools. The president has both emergency powers and regular powers at his disposal. Methane Action has posted an executive order that would use the Defense Production Act for developing and deploying these technologies, just as he has used that for improving supplies for baby formula, another necessity of modern life. And the EPA has a Toxic Substances Control Act, which can augment the Clean Air Act. They need not be one or the other, they should be both. And internationally, we have the Methane Pledge, upon which we could build. It calls on nations to develop substantive standards, enforceable standards, for most of their activities that emit methane. And it also calls on them to develop subsidies to help the agricultural producers reduce their methane emissions. We can do exactly the same here, but we are calling together the nations to see how we've done in the past year. And on that we can build and say, let's move forward to something more powerful than a simple pledge. Let's enforce these regulations together in our trade. And indeed, the Investment Reduction Act has the tools to help assess fairly the incorporated greenhouse gases in things we import that have to do with construction, steel and concrete and cement. Those tools can fairly allow us to impose trade sanctions, either tariffs or embargoes, on those carbon-intensive, greenhouse gas-intensive products and say, no, we're going to lift our commerce to a higher level and do it under the current existing international law. So the citizens of Boulder and the citizens of this country need to work with their congressmen and their representatives and their senators to bring these things about and help the administration do that. Representative Joe Negussi serves on Natural Resources Committee and the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. He's well positioned to be a leader here. So talk to your own member, work with him. Senators Hickenlooper and Bennett serve on 5 other committees with direct power over these issues. Work with them. Ask them to report back. B, subsequent folks that help before and after, help in the beginning and follow up subsequently, and make sure they stay on track. Continue to feed them the science and support them when they do the right thing and help guide them in doing the right thing. I say that as a former congressional staffer. We appreciate citizen involvement. And so finally, your organizations, your churches, your synagogues, your clubs, they all have money. They can divest and reinvest in climate solutions, in climate restoration. And they can tell their grandchildren they did the right thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Appreciate your statement. Next, we have Ken Bousselere. Ken, can you step forward online and introduce yourself and then provide your statement?
I believe Ken has a video.
Ah, I beg your pardon. Ken, you don't need to step forward. We will step you forward by video. Thank you. Emily.
My name is Ken Vessler. I'm a scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution who's been studying the ocean's role in the carbon cycle and climate for over 35 years. As we all know, we're in a climate crisis, but I think we do have options to restore the Earth and to get to a more stable and healthy climate if we consider the ocean's role in controlling climate. To get there, I have to tell you first that there's great storage potential in the ocean for carbon already happening. There's 50 times more carbon in the ocean than the atmosphere. If you add up all of the land plants and those surface oils, it's 15 to 20 times more carbon. So it's a big place to store carbon. Carbon dioxide gets in there through gas exchange. We call this a solubility pump. So as we put more and more CO2 in the atmosphere, the ocean also gets more CO2 dissolved in it. That's one of the causes. That's what causes ocean acidity. You may have heard of acidification of the ocean, which is also having detrimental effects in terms of ocean properties, like temperature increases also are changing the ocean in dramatic ways. So another thing to think about, though, you may not have heard of is the biological carbon pump. The other way CO2 gets into the ocean is through photosynthesis, right? This is the uptake of carbon dioxide by small microscopic marine plankton. Half of the oxygen produced through photosynthesis comes through these tiny marine creatures who are then eaten, and their carcasses or their fecal pellets settle to the bottom of the ocean as something we call marine snow. Now, what's interesting about this cycle is that it's very large. There's about 5 to 10 gigatons, billion tons of carbon leaving the surface ocean via the biological carbon pump. That's equivalent to 20 to 40 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. So this is essentially the same scale as annual human emissions. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is, how is this cycle changing? Is the ocean going to be taking up more or less carbon dioxide as climate changes? And can we responsibly potentially change that cycle to get more of the carbon stored durably deep in the ocean? Because some of that carbon will make its way to the deeper waters where it's stored for centuries and millennia. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit more now about. I was fortunate to be part of a National Academies Committee. 12 of us created this consensus report released in December of 2021. The idea was to focus on CDR, carbon dioxide removal, via the oceans, via 6 processes that are pretty well known, but really not studied to the point where we want to deploy right away. We want to actually look at all of these. These include methods that we call on the left biotic, things like adding nutrients, something that I'm more familiar with, ecosystem recovery in the open ocean, things like large-scale seaweed farming, and the fourth one, upwelling tubes, passive ways to bring up deep waters that are more rich in nutrients that might cause more of this marine snow, enhance the biological carbon pump. These were compared against more engineered or abiotic solutions. These involve typically changing ocean chemistry, either by adding ground up mineral or electrochemically changing that to change what's called the alkalinity or the ability to enhance CO2 uptake through that gas exchange, the solubility pump. So we looked at 6 of these. Key takeaways in this 300-page consensus report are that emissions reductions are not enough. Certainly we need to start with emission reductions. We can do that right now with technologies we have to get away from our use of fossil fuels. But the research to look at these alternatives for CDR should start now. It's not an endorsement for anyone. And of course, the technical feasibility is only one step in a 5 to 10 year program. We also have to look at governance, who controls the ocean commons, what are some of the downstream effects, what are some of the justice and social issues if you went forward with this. And we expect this to be a collaboration between federal agencies and philanthropies. And I'll end with just saying that my particular expertise is in that ocean and nutrient cycling. So we formed a group called Exploring Ocean Iron Solutions. That first word is really important. We don't have solutions to our climate crisis, but we need to be exploring them. And I think we have some optimism that with a comprehensive ocean CDR research program and several of these, we have this opportunity to invest in the knowledge necessary to ensure that we can make scientifically and ethically sound decisions for the health and safety of our planet. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Very good. We appreciate Ken's contribution to this hearing. Now I understand that Jose Jimenez is here. Welcome, and would you please come forward, Jose, with your statement. Thank you very much. Yes, and make sure that you lean into the microphone as you speak.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm a scientist. I work at the University of Colorado at Boulder. I work on aerosols, which are important for climate, and they're also the way you get COVID. It's not great to have so few people with masks in a hearing about climate, let me tell you that. But anyway, I've been focusing on climate. I've been worried about climate change for at least 3 decades since I was an undergraduate student in Spain. And I came to do my PhD in the US at MIT, and I thought I was gonna work on climate stuff. And, you know, because, I mean, the science was really well known. This was in the 1990s. And in fact, it had been well known for a century then, because Svante Arrhenius, which if you've studied chemistry, you will heard about him, and the Arrhenius rate expressions. He wrote in 1896, he started a paper about this topic saying, a great deal has been written about the effect of atmospheric absorption on the climate. So this was old news in 1896. But in the 1990s, this was very well known. And I was kind of puzzled when I arrived to MIT, and the people said, well, here there is no political will. And we are kind of still there. I mean, in the US, for reasons that are non-scientific, there has been a great deal of resistance to do anything about climate. You know, and in the 1990s, we could have avoided some of the worst consequences. That's no longer the case. I mean, I have hope that some of the new technologies will blunt the impact of climate change, but not that they will reverse it or they will save us from things that are pretty horrifying and that will make the last decade look like the calm before the storm. Okay? I mean, we have seen, you know, problems like displacement of people leading to immigration or other economic problems, how they lead to economic instability, how they lead to migration, how they lead to war. Unfortunately, the changes that are coming to the climate and having droughts, major droughts in big countries like India, or we have seen Pakistan being basically completely flooded recently, and that, or we've seen what has happened in Florida or here on the West, the larger and larger wildfires burning in the 31st of December and burning 1,000 houses. I mean, that's going to be accelerated, and that's going to produce more political and economic instability. And we have seen in the last decade what happens. That gives rise to populist governments that then exacerbate the problem and they really don't address it. And that's what we're setting ourselves up to. So I think, I mean, the bottom line is, and this is when John asked me to come, I said, well, I will go and I try to contribute my 1 cent, is because we have to do everything we can as fast as possible to address climate. It's the biggest problem we have. It's not a problem to dedicate 1% of the federal budget. It's a problem like if we were in World War II and we turn into a war footing and we dedicate half of the federal budget and half of what every one of us do to fight this problem. And you know, these legal approaches of trying to get the EPA, since the evidence is so overwhelming, you know, that what I said is going on, and the science is so clear. I think we have to try to follow every possibility that of effect change to the legal system, because we face, you know, basically 20% of the GDP of the world is fossil fuels and cars that run on fossil fuels and things like that. So with 20% of the GDP of the world, you can buy every journalist, or I mean, that's probably exaggerated, but you can influence society, you can influence politicians, and you can, you know, you can do all these things that slow down progress. Okay, so we have to do whatever we can, and I wholeheartedly support this initiative, and I hope EPA does do something about it. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Appreciate your statement. I previously called Kathleen Sands thinking that she was going to be in person, but she is in fact online, and I'm wondering if we could now turn to Kathleen.
Okay, it looks like I'm on here. How long do I have?
You have 5 minutes, Kathleen.
Okay, I'm going to try to read fast. I have a lot to say. Kathleen Sands, and I started Lions Climate Action Group this summer because I was upset about the climate change and wanted to make a difference. I read a book on the subject from a local author called, the book's called A Finer Future, which inspired me to act and discusses how to act locally and think globally. So I learned in the book a huge issue for our climate is the chemicals we use on our soils. It states that next to fossil fuels, agriculture and the use of chemicals is the second biggest accelerator for climate change. Herbicides render our soils infertile or poisonous to people, wildlife, and native plants, which are key for the balance of our ecosystem. This morning at 7:40 a.m., just as kids were being dropped off for school, Boulder County Parks and Open Space sprayed indaziflam, a close cousin to glyphosate, an EPA-approved herbicide, near my son's school and the town of Lyons. I kept my son home for the day. Our community begged the county and open space not to do it, and our town has even adopted a non-chemical weed management program, yet our voices were clearly not heard. 40 people showed up to an emergency meeting held in town, and they discussed how we could eradicate cheatgrass, which is what they're trying to do, mitigate for fire naturally, how we can do it naturally. And they didn't listen to any of it except for that they moved it from our creek, luckily, and a few homes. That my mother lives right next to there too and is immune compromised and was ill and could not leave. Boulder County, especially Parks and Open Space, need to start looking at the science and the dangers of these chemicals and climate change in general, and the wishes of the community they work for, and stop this kind of practice. We begged the commissioners over the past week also to stop the spray and look at this more closely, and we were denied. In 2019, there was a hearing with the commissioners who said that they were directing Parks and Open Space to do a plan for phasing out chemicals, but instead they've increased the usage. Not sure what happened there. CMEX is the #1 polluter by far in Boulder County and #4 in Colorado, whose mining permit was expiring after 25 years, which is a huge unique opportunity to close this hugely polluting cement plant. Instead, Boulder County Open Space partnered with CMEX on a proposal to extend their mine 15 years for about $17 million worth of money and land. Luckily, the commissioner saw the woefully inadequate application without public health or environmental health impact studies. And the community did those studies out of our own pockets. And they ignored the county's own sustainability plan as well, of reducing carbons by 2030. But luckily, they saw the wisdom in allowing that mine to close. So it did. But we need to ask Boulder County to please continue with this plan to phase out chemicals in our own county as the community wants, and to do our part in helping the climate crisis and steward our own land here in Boulder County. Now, the city of Boulder is immune somehow to this because they're wise enough to have gotten off of the chemicals locally. The town of Lyons is going to try to negotiate some plan there, but right now they are just exposing us to these chemicals without our wishes, and it's going to take years for that soil to recover. So I would implore, and also this spraying campaign is going on all over Boulder County. I've asked for the map and the schedule. They're not providing it. So I would implore the city and the people of Boulder and all of you climate experts to talk to the county and the commissioners and let them know how you feel about it, how it connects to climate change, and to start working for what the county wants and looking towards their own sustainability plan and working towards climate change. I think that's all I have to say right now.
Thank you very much for your statement, Kathleen. Appreciate it. The next three speakers will be Guy Brassier. These will all be remote, Paolo Artoyo and Jim Haagen-Smit. So, Guy, if you are with us online, and we'd like you to come forward and provide your statement.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Guy Brassier. I've been working for a long time at NCAR. I'm now a distinguished scholar at NCAR. I'm also working at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Germany. And I'm talking to you from the south of Patagonia, the south of Chile today, a region that is fragile. We see it with the glacier retracting, for example. And so I'd like to make a few comments. And first, of course, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have asked our planet to give us more than it has to offer. And so we are in a geological period now dominated by human activity, which we call the Anthropocene. And we see in that period the sign of saturation. We see that we are going beyond what we call planetary boundaries. And we are therefore exploiting our capital beyond what the carrying capacity can be. And so the question is really, how can we return to a sustainable path? How can we basically take the real decision that need to be taken? And what are the actionable pathways? So what I'd like to do here is to refer to a document that a group to which I belong, called the Earth League, which scientists from all over the world has been putting together. And it has been discussed recently in New York in a meeting called the Global Futures. There are 10 what we call must-haves that are kind of highlighted. I'm going to go through them very briefly. The first one, of course, is that we need to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees, and we need to do that by 2050. I'll get back to that. That's the major challenge that I want to discuss. But also, we have to make sure that we're not creating more loss to the function of nature and the services that nature provides. And of course, biodiversity is key here. We want to create an economy that operates within the safe and planetary boundaries that I was mentioning. We need an equitable access, essentially, to responsible consumption for all of us. We need to transform our governance to really create a condition by which we can stay within the planetary boundaries. We need, of course, to ensure healthy and secure food for the global population. We need a healthy planet for all human beings, meaning health is a very important issue. And a safe digital world providing security, equity, and also education. We need stability in our planet. We need peace. Peace is very important for a global society. And finally, more generally, we need to create a global society that is resilient. So we have today 28 years to reach a net zero carbon economy. How do we do that? How do we get to that transition? How do we make this transition to be just and fair? So basically, wealthier country like the US must take responsibility. They must become a role model for the rest of the world. And that has not always been the case, for the least. US must accelerate the path away from fossil fuel energy. How to do that? We need to stop new investment and end the use of coal, oil, fuel, gases as much as possible, which means that we need to move probably from billion to trillion dollars in terms of implementing a new energy system. We need to develop a large program for saving energy. We need to rethink our transformation system, to rethink our urban development strategy, our consumption modes, and also our agricultural production system. We need to eliminate the support that lead to a degradation of life-supporting goals, and we need to internalize, in fact, our environmental cost into our economy. That's a very big change. And so I'm going to just finish by a sentence that I took from Ricky Rood. You heard him a bit earlier. The political and economic barriers today are higher than the uncertainty in the science. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your statement, Guy. The next is Paolo Artoyo. Paolo, if you're with us online, could you
I don't see him on Zoom.
He's not on Zoom, okay. Is Jim Haagen-Smit on Zoom? Okay. Jim Haagen-Smit, if you could come forward online, provide your statement, we'd appreciate it.
Sorry, had to unmute it first. So a little background, Jim Haagen-Smit. I'm the grandson of A.J. Haagen-Smit. He was, if you don't know, he was known as the father of smog and air pollution control worldwide. He started his research back in the 40s and 50s. He was the first chairman of the California Air Resources Board, and as part of that, he was certainly leading in reducing toxic air pollution, as was known back in those days. In the 50s, the oil industry tried to discredit him. Nothing new here, I guess. That just caused him to redouble his efforts. And then in 1973, then Governor Reagan removed him from the ARB board chairmanship for attempting to institute some retrofits on cars. Governments will try to suppress the people that are trying to do good and save the world. So toxic air pollution, I'll just add also, while I have not worked directly in the air pollution control components of the world, I've definitely been a conservationist, and I've currently serving on the board of the Placer Land Trust, trying to conserve land and protect the environment. So toxic CO2 pollution shares many similarities to the air pollution of the 50s and 60s. It's really no different from those early air pollution efforts, just a more monumental task and more consequential to the world. It is solvable, and we must solve it, and solve it now. We've wasted a lot of time, given that definitely it was known back in the 60s and 70s and before that, likely. People like my grandfather expressed late in his career in the 60s and early 70s that it was time to start worrying about issues such as CO2, toxic CO2 pollution, and other damages we were doing. In some cases, reversible damages to the planet. However, we're learning with technology that there are ways to solve our problems. I'll add, in 1973, in a lecture he gave, The Sins of Waste, one of his statements was, "We can afford clean air and water. No generation before us has a greater responsibility, and no one has had a greater opportunity to better our life on Earth. Let us all join hands in this wonderful goal." And I'll just add, so now is the time to act aggressively. So thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your testimony. The next three speakers, if they are online, are Chuck Kusher, Kevin Anderson, and Daniel Richter. Are they online, Emily? Okay. So, Chuck, are you able to materialize and provide your statement online to us?
Okay, good morning. I'm Dr. Chuck Kutcher. I was a researcher and manager at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory for 40 years until my retirement in 2018. I'm now a fellow of the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute at the University of Colorado-Boulder, and I'm currently teaching the Sustainable Energy course in the CU Mechanical Engineering Department. It's been 34 years since Dr. Hansen's landmark testimony to Congress informing us that the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas was causing rapid climate change. We've seen the effects around the world in the form of heat waves, droughts, more intense rainfall events, flooding, and so on. We've also experienced it close to home. The three largest wildfires in Colorado history all occurred in the year 2020. Last year, in 2021, the Marshall Fire destroyed 1,000 homes, making it the most destructive wildfire in Colorado history, and that occurred in the wintertime. The Southwest is experiencing the worst drought in 1,200 years, and the two largest reservoirs in the United States, Lake Mead and Lake Powell on the Colorado River, are so low that they're now getting very close to dead pool condition. Back when Dr. Hansen testified, we didn't have very low-cost solutions, but today we do. In the last decade, wind power has dropped in cost by over 70%, and the cost of solar electricity has dropped by an astounding 90%, making them the cheapest sources of electricity at under 4 cents a kilowatt hour. The cost of batteries has dropped even faster, and most new utility-scale solar projects now incorporate 4 hours or more of battery storage. It's clear the number one thing we must do is convert our electric grid to carbon-free sources as fast as possible. Thanks to a push from the Colorado State Legislature, Xcel is working to produce 80% of our electricity from solar and wind within just the next 8 years. But we need the federal government to enact a clean electricity standard that will require utilities across the country to be carbon-free by 2035. The second thing we have to do is electrify our transportation and building sectors to take advantage of this clean electric grid. This means converting cars, trucks, and buses from gasoline and diesel to battery electric vehicles and replacing the natural gas furnaces in our homes with today's high-performance cold climate heat pumps. My wife and I have done both of these things, and I can attest to the fact that our life is better as a result. Our electric car is quick, quiet, and gets filled up with electricity in our garage instead of at a gas station. The cost of powering our car with electricity is about 1/3 the cost of gasoline, and maintenance consists of rotating the tires and adding windshield washer fluid. Our heat pump efficiently heats our house in the winter and cools it in the summer. And thanks to our electric induction stove, we can boil water in seconds instead of minutes, and the air in our kitchen is free of the nitrogen oxide pollutants that are emitted by gas stoves. We need the federal government to accelerate electrification by requiring that all new buildings be all electric as soon as possible, and by providing incentives for installing heat pumps in existing buildings. It's important that tax incentives for EVs continue and that a reliable nationwide high-speed charging network be completed that includes megawatt-scale charging stations for electric trucks. It's also about time we put a price on carbon dioxide emissions commensurate with the widespread damages these emissions cause. And we need to finally eliminate the tens of billions of dollars in subsidies that still go to coal, oil, and natural gas every year, the very things that are causing climate change. The good news about climate change is that it's not too late to act. Today's best scientific models show that after we stop burning fossil fuels, the Earth's temperature will quickly level off and begin to decrease. Weather conditions will start to improve instead of continuing to get worse. For this to happen, we have to reject the disinformation being circulated by those who want to keep making money the old polluting way and listen to what the scientists are telling us. If we do, not only will the climate improve, but so will our air quality. And with those improvements will come healthier and happier lives. And yes, this can be done without creating an economic burden. In fact, we'll see hundreds of billions of dollars in savings in healthcare costs alone. We have the solutions we need, and we're already doing many of the right things, but we need to have the courage to do them even faster. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that statement, Chuck. And now, I'd like to call forth online Kevin Anderson.
Hello, my name is Kevin Anderson. I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester and also here in Uppsala in Sweden. And for my sins, I used to be a design engineer in the oil and gas industry for many years indeed. Now, the US is a signatory to the 1992 UNFCCC article, where Article 2 states that the US, along with all other signatories, looks to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. But also to do that in accordance with the concept of equity enshrined in the agreement as common but differentiated responsibilities, often referred to as CBDR. Subsequently, as a signatory to the Paris Agreement, the US also agreed to play its role in holding the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade and pursue efforts to limit that warming to an increase of only 1.5 degrees centigrade. Again, in the Paris Agreement, it reflects the concept of equity and the principle of CBDR, but also to undertake rapid reductions in accordance with the available science. In 2018, the IPCC published a special report on 1.5 degrees centigrade. And from then, I think it was very clear that 1.5 has become really the more sort of reasoned threshold that can be classified as dangerous interference with the climate system. And on the back of that, 1.5 was then reiterated in the 2021 G7 meeting and the subsequent Glasgow COP26, both of which the US was a signatory to. So I take this US signatory to all of these various agreements at face value. I do not assume that the various leaders were lying or looking to circumvent the letter or indeed the spirit of such agreements through some sort of legal gamesmanship. So I take them at their word. With a focus on mitigation, my job as an academic is relatively simple. It's to assess what nations need to do to meet their commitments, their temperature and equity commitments, as enshrined in the Paris Agreement and to which they signed up to. I'm guided by the Paris Agreement, the requirement in there to undertake rapid reductions in accordance with the best available science. For that, I take the IPCC Assessment Report 6 carbon budgets, these are the latest ones that we have, as my headline framing for these issues, recognizing that those budgets themselves do miss many of the major feedbacks. I transpose the language of the Paris Agreement. I don't know if it's frozen or not here, I actually can't tell.
Kevin, first your picture froze and now audio is frozen. So perhaps what you might do is link back in, and we'll see if we can get you back again. Okay, so then, Emily, I think right now then we should move on to Daniel Richter as Kevin is trying to get back in, and then we'll see if we've got Kevin back online. So, Danny Richter, are you able to come forward?
I'm here.
Excellent. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Danny Richter. Today, I speak representing the Pricing Carbon Initiative, or PCI. We work with a range of stakeholders to foster safe dialogue, explore effective approaches, and ultimately encourage action to price carbon that is viable, equitable, complementary to other policies that focus more on regulations and green incentives, and commensurate with the challenge of climate disruption. PCI was very happy to have Donn Viviani of the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, co-host of this hearing, at our last convening. Thank you, Donn and Dan, for the invitation to participate in this hearing. The efforts of your organization to have the Environmental Protection Agency seriously consider enacting a carbon fee via the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, is praiseworthy, and it is especially fitting that it take place here in Boulder, Colorado. The city of Boulder, is the other co-host of this hearing, is a true pioneer in climate policymaking, as it adopted a carbon price as early as 2007. When Boulder residents have another chance to light the way for the rest of the country next Tuesday, Election Day, with a vote on the ballot initiative to expand the scope of this carbon price, we will be eagerly watching the results. It's an honor to speak here with committed climate champions such as these. We're operating in a context where major federal climate legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, was just signed into law. This legislation will be transformative. However, even as an advocate of that transformative legislation, I am moved by multiple independent estimates that the policies contained therein fall roughly 10% short of our 2030 nationally determined contribution under the Paris Climate Agreement relative to 2005 emissions. To complete the task, the United States must do a lot more. Aside from the very important methane fee contained therein, the IRA is almost entirely composed of green incentives. Since the policy options for addressing climate can roughly be grouped into making it cheaper to be quote-unquote carbon virtuous, or green incentives, making it expensive to lack such carbon virtue and regulations, the United States must make up the shortfall of our commitment either by making it more expensive to use fossil fuels or with regulations. Carbon fees are one way to make it more expensive to lack carbon virtue. They work by adding a cost onto fossil fuels based on the amount of carbon intrinsic to that fuel. I'll briefly point out that carbon fees are simple, widespread, and effective. Carbon fees are very simple for governments to implement, polluters to calculate, and voters to understand. For governments, the small number of choke points, roughly 2,000 who would have to pay the fee in the United States, mean low administrative costs and thus less taxpayer money spent to administer it. Simple. For polluters, the amount of embedded carbon is extremely well characterized, meaning the effort to calculate this fee for fossil fuel companies is trivial, easy. As a consumer, if I consume fewer fossil fuels, I spend less money. If I'm carbon virtuous, I save. I also want to highlight that carbon prices are widespread, both within the United States and internationally. Carbon fees are a subspecies of carbon price. Internationally, 34 out of 36 developed economies have a carbon price in place. This does not include large developing economies such as China, Indonesia, and Argentina, among others, which also have carbon prices in place. Thus, the United States is increasingly isolated among big economies for our lack of a carbon price. And the risks grow each day that American companies will bear costs that could be avoided with a national domestic carbon price. Carbon prices are also widespread within the United States at the regional, state, and municipal level. Examples include the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, in the Northeast, the California Cap and Trade Program created by AB 32, and the aforementioned City of Boulder's climate tax. Severance fees are a related policy that exists in 34 states and are particularly common in states with robust fossil fuel industries. Carbon fees are also effective. There is a rich economics literature around carbon prices informed by at least 3 different data sources: extant carbon prices, natural experiments, and other similar economic policies. Because carbon prices are so widespread, there's a lot of data on how effective they are. These data tell a clear story of carbon prices reducing emissions. The innate volatility of fossil fuel prices has created many natural experiments on how consumers respond to high fossil fuel prices. Consumers buy fewer fossil fuels when they're more expensive. A carbon price is a type of Pigouvian taxation, where governments seek to make undesirable goods cost more. First described in 1920, this policy lever has been applied to tobacco and sugar in addition to carbon. In other words, economists have over 100 years of data regarding consumer responses to higher prices. It is this rich database that leads overwhelming majorities of economists to conclude that a carbon fee will be effective. To conclude, the United States is an outlier among developed economies and increasingly compared to large developing economies as well. While stellar, the Inflation Reduction Act is not going to allow the United States to meet our own commitments. More must be done, and the simplest, most widespread, and most effective option left to us is a carbon fee. Thank you for paying attention.
Thank you very much, Danny. And I could note for the audience that a rising carbon fee is part of the CPR Initiative petition that could be one of the available tools to the Environmental Protection Agency upon its determination that greenhouse gas pollution imposes an unreasonable risk on health and the environment. Okay, excellent. All right, I'm delighted to see, I think, that Professor Kevin Anderson is back with us, and you were just beginning to get into your substantive treatment, I think, of the United States' obligations to meet the various commitments that we have become a signatory to. So please, Professor Anderson, with the rest of your statement, appreciate it.
Okay, I apologize for that. It shows us sometimes that we mustn't be too over-reliant on technologies for all our solutions. So I'm not sure exactly where I got cut off there, but basically my job as an academic is simply to translate the commitments that we've made into what that means for us at a national level. So I'm guided by the Paris Agreement and then the science of the IPCC, which I take from the Assessment Report 6, the carbon budgets that are actually in the Assessment Report 6. I then transpose the language in the Paris Agreement around 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade into a 50% chance of not exceeding 1.5, so not a great chance, it's a 50-50, or an 83% chance, following the language of the IPCC, for staying below 2 degrees centigrade, so a good chance of being well below 2 degrees. The carbon budgets associated with those, given by the IPCC, are respectively about 500 and 900 billion tons of carbon dioxide from 2020, which may not mean a lot to many of you. But then you have to adjust that. The fact is we're now in November 2022, so those budgets are now about 390 and 790 billion tons. And remember, these don't include some important sets of feedbacks, which may make them considerably smaller. At the current rate of global emissions, around about 41 billion tons of carbon dioxide, that's 9 to 19 years of current emissions at the global level. That's all the budgets we have left. 9 to 19 years, 19 years being the 2 degrees centigrade, 9 being the 1.5. Now, the Paris Agreement also divides the world into two simple groups, developed and developing country parties, as they're called in the agreement. And then it gives a bit of leeway to the poorer countries, developing countries, under the concept of common but differentiated responsibility, which again, we've all signed up to. So, but using those criteria, developed and developing country parties, through some peer-reviewed work that I've carried out with some colleagues, we've looked to divide the world into two sections, two groups, and then to ask, of the developed countries, what should the budget be allocated to the different nations, different of the wealthier nations? We use a simple grandfathering approach here that typically favors the high-emitting nations, high-emitting per capita nations such as the USA, and actually makes it more challenging for some of the lower-emitting per capita nations such as Sweden, where I am today. Our provisional extrapolation of the method would see the US carbon budget for 1.5 at about 22 billion tons of CO2 from now out to forever. That's about 4.5 years of current US emissions. That's a reduction rate of about 21% per annum starting now, or if you were to draw a straight line for the same budget, it would be about 0 emissions in 2029. For 2 degrees centigrade, it's 45 billion tonnes, roughly twice the amount, because the budget's roughly twice as big. That's about 12% per annum reductions starting now, or if you were to draw a straight line, 0 emissions from the US by 2037. Now, in many respects, as I say, these numbers favour the US because they don't take account of historical emissions or the fact that the US has done almost nothing about climate change meaningfully since 1990. Its emissions are effectively unchanged. Put simply, when you do the maths and then compare that with the Inflation Reduction Act, it shows that the IRA may have political significance, but it has nothing to do with the US delivering on its Paris commitments. We're left in a difficult position for the US, indeed for many of the industrialized parts of the world, that we require a Marshall-style deployment of existing low-carbon technologies. That's a prerequisite for the US delivering on Paris. But in 2022, it is far from sufficient. We also have to acknowledge the huge asymmetry in responsibility for emissions across the US population, or indeed any other country that has deep levels of inequality like the US, the UK do, for instance. Technology plus deep equity-based social change, however that may be played out, may just about hold emissions within the small and rapidly reducing 1.5 to 2 degrees C carbon budgets. Now that conclusion certainly is one that many of us high emitters don't like, but ultimately the physics doesn't care whether we like it or not. It only cares whether it's right or wrong. And I would argue that the simple maths and the arithmetic taken from the IPCC as shown here demonstrates that there is very little choice or flexibility in these numbers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for your testimony. I would like to remind you and others that there's the opportunity to submit additional testimony or papers on which you may have based some of your testimony to us in writing, and that is at cprclimate.org. Okay, it appears that we have just one more person who is registered here with us today. That is Isabel Lisely, or Lise. And if you would like to come to the podium and provide your testimony, we would appreciate it. Welcome.
Can she go 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Isabel Lyle, and I am 24 years old, in the same category of youth that are fearful that the psychiatrist mentioned earlier of what's happening with the future of our planet. So I just felt moved to speak, and I started writing a bunch of things down. I'm also a current resident of Boulder County and a student in the Masters of the Environment program at CU Boulder. I'm actually in Jonathan's class, and many of us are as well here today. So thank you, Jonathan. It seems to me that many of us are already aware of the impacts of fossil fuels on our planet. We know and understand the importance of addressing this issue. But do we know how to create systems-level, effective and long-lasting change to reduce our carbon emissions across the country? Earlier this morning, and correct me if I'm wrong, John mentioned that the U.S. consumes 1/3 of the U.S. goods. 1/3. Dan also stated that the U.S. has created 25% of global emissions since the Industrial Revolution. As I've been sitting here wrestling with these facts, I've been thinking about a few questions of my own. If many of these emissions come from industry, manufacturing, and consumption, how do we recreate our culture around consumerism to prevent the emissions created from the extraction, production, and distribution of goods? Is there a way to think about how we consume products in a more circular economic approach? And my second question has to do with transportation. Electrifying our transportation system, of course, would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But it doesn't get to the root of the issue. How do we phase out car culture to create more walkable cities that are connected by efficient, effective public transportation systems? I'm impressed by the initiatives the City of Boulder has already taken on climate, but we need to address these issues nationally and globally to truly make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there other persons who were previously registered or otherwise wish to testify? Okay, well then I'll make a couple of concluding remarks if that's okay. Jonathan, first of all, we greatly again appreciate the partnership with the City of Boulder in sponsoring this hearing. We're happy that Jonathan's students were able to attend, even if they were compelled to attend. Thank you for your participation. During the course of this hearing, we've had about 60 or 70 people actually with us in attendance. And then I think it should be noted that there's also been a substantial elephant in the room, and it's worth perhaps a word about that. And that is that we meet on November 1 week before the end of this general election in the United States, the midterm elections, and we confront not only the climate crisis but an inordinate challenge to the American democratic experiment and the rule of law, featuring, of course, the remarkable conspiracy that did lead to the unprecedented assault on the United States Congress and recurrent and increasing threats on some of our political leaders and even their families. Well, there are solutions. Many of the solutions to the climate crisis were discussed here today. There is a solution, of course, to the recurrent violations of the rule of law, the challenge to the rule of law, and that is the enforcement of the law. There's solutions to the current challenge to our democratic right to choose our elected leaders, and that is organizing and actually getting out to vote. And there's challenge to there are solutions to the present challenge to the spirit of democracy, and that is for people to come together and consider the problems in a reasonable way, to discuss, even to hold public hearings, and I think that's what we attempted to demonstrate here today. This, as I noted at the outset, is the first of a number of public hearings, resources permitting, and with the involvement of similar partners, we hope to continue to explore the methods and manner in which our government could do more to confront the climate crisis. On behalf of the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, we welcome your present involvement and your continuing involvement. And again, thank you very much to the city. This hearing, I guess, is concluded. Thank you very much.